Hey kids, Flexing Teacher Weber here. Hope you're having a good day. We have been working with percentages, and we have been looking at fractions and decimals as well and how they're related. And we have been looking at these things in relation to pictures, and now we've gradually moved on to the more conceptual idea of it. So what we've been doing is starting off with different versions of numbers and converting them to the other forms. So for example, 8 out of 10. Well, in decimal form, we know this is a base 10 number. So 1 0 on 10 means the decimal will have one decimal spot, and there has to be 8 tenths in that tenths decimal spot. So the decimal would be 0 and 8 tenths. So we look at 1 0 on the 10. That's the tenths place, so 8 tenths. Now, the concept of percent is that it's a fraction out of 100. So we have to reimagine this fraction as a fraction out of 100. And we can do that by making an equivalent fraction where we multiply the numerator by 10 to make 100 and do the same thing to the top. And we get 80 out of 100. So that's 80%. That's the kind of thing we're doing right now. Let's look at another one. So we also looked at a fraction that's out of 20. Well, there's a couple ways we could attack this. To make this a decimal, we could make it out of 10 or we could make it out of 100. Well, to do the percent, we're going to have to picture it out of 100. So let's picture it out of 100. To go from 20 to 100, we multiply by 5. And we will do the same thing to the top. 14 times 5. I might think of that as 10 times 5 and 4 times 5. 10 times 5 is 50 and 4 times 5 is 20. So that means 14 times 5 is 70. Now we can make our decimal and our percent. 2 zeros on 100 means a tenths and a hundredths decimal spot for 70 hundredths, or 0 and 70 hundredths. Now, we can also just think of that as 7 tenths as well. They're the same thing. The percent is a fraction out of 100, so that's 70%. Okay, we did another 1 out of 20. I won't do that one, but we also looked at out of 25. Now, to make the decimal, we have to have a fraction of 10, 100, 1,000. We can make this out of 100. To go from 25 to 100, we multiply by 4. And since we're making an equivalent fraction, we do the same thing to the top. 22 times 4. Well, that's 88. Now we can make the decimal, 2 zeros on 100. That gives us tenths hundredths. 88 hundredths. And 88 out of 100 means 88%. Okay, so we did ones out of 25. And then we did fractions out of 50, and same idea. To make the decimal, you need to make a fraction out of 10, 100, or 1,000. Well, 50 can be made out of 100 by timesing by 2. Timesing by 2. That's 26. 2 zeros on 100. 2 decimal spots. 2 tenths and 6 hundredths for 26 hundredths. And the percent is 26 out of 100, so 26%. That's the kind of thing we've been working with. Now, all these ones started with a fraction. What happens if we start with a decimal and we want to make the fraction and the percent? Well, 18 hundredths. 2 decimal spots, which means our fraction will have to have a denominator with 2 zeros in it. So the denominator will be 100, and we have to have 18 hundredths. So 18 out of 100. Now, what I've been encouraging the kids to do is see if they can get their fractions in simplest form. Well, both 18 and 100 are divisible by 2. So we can divide the numerator by 2 and the denominator by 2, and we get 9 over 50. And we also already know that percent means a fraction out of 100, so the percent will be 18%. And what happens if we have a fraction that's in the tenths, or a decimal that's in the tenths? That's 4/10. Got to be careful. 4/10, 1 decimal spot, which means our fraction, the denominator, will only have 1 0. 1 decimal spot, tenths, 1 0 in the denominator of the fraction. And we have 4 of those tenths. Now, we want to make a percent. We want to make a fraction out of 100 because that's what percent is. So to go from 10 to 100, it's times 10, and do the same thing to the top. And we get an equivalent fraction of 40 out of 100, which is 40%. Now, I've also been encouraging kids to take the fraction and make it in simplest form. So 4 out of 10, the numerator and denominator are both divisible by 2, so that's 2 out of 5. Okay, so there's questions like that where we might not have a decimal that's got 2 decimal spots to make 100. Let's look at one like this, 2 hundredths. Well, 2 hundredths. To make the fraction, look at the number of decimal spots. 1, 2. That means my fraction has to have 1, 2 zeros in the denominator. And it's going to be 2 out of 100 because this is 2 in the hundredth spot. So 2 out of 100. 2 out of 100 means that's 2%. And if I want to make this fraction in simplest form, I divide the numerator and denominator by 2, and I get 1 over 50. Pardon me. So we did ones like that. And then the last thing we did is we looked at what happens if you start with a percent. Well, percent means 26%. The definition of percent is a fraction out of 100. So 26 out of 100. And as a decimal, the 2 zeros in 100 tell us there are 2 decimal spots, a tenths and a hundredths, and we need to have 26 hundredths, 0 and 26 hundredths. To get this in simplest form, we recognize that both the numerator and denominator are even numbers, so we could potentially chop them in half by dividing by 2. 26 chopped in half is 13, and 100 chopped in half is 50. And in simplest form, this fraction is 13 over 50. We can't simplify it anymore. That's all the stuff we've been working on. I gave the kids a practice assignment today that looked like this, where they had to fill in the blanks of the fraction, decimal, percent. I also gave them a bonus assignment that isn't on here that has some more challenging questions if they need that. This is the one that's due tomorrow. I hope that helps. That's all for now. Flexing Teacher Weber, out.